Hello everyone, this is MMA Sherlock for the Bluff the Spot High Stakes course. In this video I am going to cover blind versus blind play. It's really important to work on your blind versus blind game because it comes up very often. You're playing a very wide range out of position, which is very difficult, and it's very easy to make large mistakes. So having confidence in your strategy, knowing what you're doing is very, very important. Of course, it all starts with a proper preflop strategy. If your preflop strategy is not good, your postflop strategy cannot be much better either. Now, first off, preflop out of position. Some general tips. Do not limp the small blind. I see some regs at mid stakes and at low stakes limp the small blind, and that is just a mistake because of the rake. When you limp the small blind and your opponent checks, you see the flop. Once you see the flop, the pot gets raked. If you raise and your opponent folds, you don't pay rake. So playing in a way to avoid rake is very important, especially when you go down in stakes, because the rake is such a big factor. At high stakes, you'll see lots of players limp, but they don't really have to worry about rake. For example, rake at 25-50 is only 0.8 big blinds, but at low stakes, the rake can exceed 10 big blinds. The EV difference between a limping strategy as well as a raise-only strategy is virtually the same, at least with no antes. So with the high rake, you're losing a significant amount. Plus, limping as well as raising is much more difficult than only raising, and it's already not very easy to play out of position with wide ranges. So do not limp the small blind. That is my advice. Unless you're playing an ante game, but those are quite rare at lower stakes. Second off, be tight out of position. A few years ago, everybody was heavily overfolding their blinds, which meant that open raising a wide range was very profitable. But nowadays, people don't overfold as much anymore, so you cannot raise 50+% from the small blind anymore. So make sure to not raise too much pre-flop unless your opponent is making a significant mistake. Somewhere in the low 40s against a good opponent is my recommendation. We should also 4-bet very aggressively against 3-bets, because calling 3-bets out of position frankly really sucks. You're out of position without the initiative with a weak range. So you cannot allow villain to 3-bet too many hands and see the flop and realize a lot of equity, so you're going to have to 4-bet him to make him pay to see the flop. So deep stacked, you should adjust your play as well. A suited ace, for instance, is worth a lot more at 200 big blinds than at 100 big blinds. If you hit your nut flush and your opponent also has a flush, you just have far more in terms of implied odds. So playing hands that can make the nuts is far more important when you're playing deep than at 100 big blinds or less. So going towards short stack play, you often have to play a bit tighter. Fold equity is more important, and it's all about high cards. It's all about fold equity. So hands like 5-4 suited play very badly at 40 big blinds because you'll be unblocking 3-bet ranges and continuing ranges in general. When you hit your flush, you're not going to make more than 40 big blinds, so there's not as much incentive to draw. So playing speculative hands like that doesn't really work at 40 big blinds. How should imposition respond? We have to 3-bet quite aggressively, so out of position doesn't realize too much equity. Even if he raises a fairly weak hand, if he gets to see the flop and often the turn and the river, he realizes a lot of equity. So you have to 3-bet aggressively to make him pay to see the flop. Of course, you also have to call a wide range so that your opponent doesn't have too much fold equity right away. But rake is a very important factor. The higher the rake, the less you can call. Because as I mentioned before, once you call, the pot gets raked. So the lower you play, the more important a high frequency 3-bet strategy is. On to the flop. We're mostly going to cover out of position in this video because there's way more decisions to make for out of position, and frankly, far more difficult ones. So first off, we have to be very aggressive on boards that are good for our range. For instance, high card boards, as well as boards that nobody really hits. For instance, Ace Jack 4. That's a board where in position has no sets other than pocket fours. Ace Jack may get 3 bets a decent amount, or Ace 4 suited. Out of position is going to have every single good hand, and he's also not going to have weak hands like, let's say, 6-3 suited that the big blind may defend. So out of position is doing extremely well on those boards. Another example is King 4-3, where the king is quite a bit better for out of position, and the 4 and the 3 are such low cards that in position doesn't really hit them. And unless he has exactly 5-6, he doesn't really have much equity. He can only have maybe an overcard and a gut shot if, let's say, he has Ace 5, which still is not that much equity. So you have to be very aggressive on board. So you have to be very aggressive on good boards for your range. You also have to pot control on boards that are very bad for your range. An example would be 6-5-4 flush draw. In position is going to have more pairs than you. He's going to have 7-8 offsuit, whereas you should probably not raise that. He will have every set. He will have tons of pair plus open-enders. He will have 2 overcards almost every single time. Villain is going to have a lot of equity in position, so you have to be really careful. Even if you have a hand like pocket 5s on 6-5-4, are you that happy on the flop? Yes, sure. But there's 2 more cards to come. There's so many cards that hurt your action. Now imagine if you have a hand like pocket 9s, let's say. Just a good hand. It's just going to lose value on so many different runouts. So you really want to pot control there. There's 2 ways of going about playing blind versus blind out of position. You can play a simplified strategy, or you can play a mixed strategy. So soon I'll be going into Pile Solver, and I'll be showing you some boards where I think you should mix up your strategy, and also some boards where I think you should play a full bet or check strategy. Out of position, in general, I would recommend not being too fancy because it's far more easy to make a mistake than when you're in position. So the first board is Ace Jack 4 Rainbow. I ran the sim with 3 sizes, third pot, half pot, and 75% pot, and third pot was the only sizing which was used at a high frequency, so I ran it again to make it more accurate. If you want to know more about that, check out the How to Study with Pile Solver video. Anyway, once I allowed Pile Solver to only bet third pot, you'll see that it bets 30% pot 90% of the time. So virtually always. So on a board like this, you can just bet your entire range. And then you don't have to worry about checking and checking good hands, or how to spread your nuts, or how to check raise in those spots, because that'll never happen. So I ran the tree again and only allowed it to bet. And you'll see that the EV difference is extremely minimal. So here you see the final sim, Ace Jack 4. I forced a 100% bet strategy. And you'll see that out of position has a ton of EV. It has an EV of 36.691 out of 60. That's quite a lot. And it has 58% equity. That is a lot. So you can click here on strategy and you'll see it bets 100%. So on Ace Jack 4, a great board for us, we bet our full range. I'll give you another example, King 4 Deuce Rainbow. I ran the same type of sim with King 4 Deuce, and it only bet third pot. So I ran the sim again and only allowed the third pot sizing, and you'll see that it c-bets roughly 76% of the time. So the strategy is not as pure as on Ace Jack 4, but it's still somewhat close. I ran it again with only a third pot bet and no checks, and I saw that the EV difference was extremely minimal. So on boards where you're c-betting 75+% of the time, you can simplify your strategy and bet your full range. which means it will look like this. So a full range bet, and you don't have to worry about what happens after your check, because that you've eliminated that part of the game tree. On these previous two boards, I showed you that I prefer a full range bet. If you did that on 6-5-4 flush draw, you'd be making a huge mistake. So you see here that the solver only bets 9% of the time, so almost never. If you run that sim again and force it to check out of position, you'll again see that the EV difference is minimal. And then you don't have to worry about putting strong hands in your betting range, as well as strong draws, as well as strong backdoors, and still having a strong checking range. So I suggest checking your full range in a spot like this. So these previous types of boards were easy. We can see bet our full range, or we can check our full range. Now let's go into some boards where neither strategy really works. So ace 10-9 flush draw. A very good board for out of position, right? We have all the sets, all the two pairs, all the high equity draws. It's difficult for us to have nothing unless we have, let's say, 6-5 of hearts. At the same time, in position is going to have most of those draws as well, and most of the two pairs, just not the sets. So this board is definitely better for out of position, which you can see right here. It has 57% equity, but in position is doing quite well as well. The board is also very draw heavy, unlike, let's say, the king 4 deuce, where it's very difficult for a villain to have a lot of equity. Here, in position does have queen jack and jack 8 and flush draws, etc. So you see here that Pilot Solver prefers a large bet. It bets large almost always, and then it sometimes bets smaller. So here I would try and simplify using one sizing on the flop and only betting large. You cannot bet your whole range then, but this board is certainly too good for you to check your full range on. So this is the final sim with a 75% or check strategy. You'll see that it checks quite a bit over half the time, and then it bets quite a polarized range. So it's important that we go into this now. If we bet our full range, obviously your pre-flop range is just your flop C betting range. So let's look at some tendencies here. You'll see that top pair with a good kicker gets bet almost always, and then the weaker our kicker, the less often we bet. That makes sense. You'll see that kings, queens, and jacks get bet very infrequently because they're medium strength hands that need almost no protection. You'll see that, for instance, pairs like 8, 7s, and 6s get bet very infrequently. They are third pair hands that are a little bit too good to bluff, but a little bit too weak to value bet. You'll see that it does bet the under pairs most of the time because they are simply not good enough to show down, and you want to have some bluffs when all the obvious draws get there. You'll see that Pi also checks some nuts, like let's say aces. It checks aces about 90% of the time. I mean, that's pretty extreme. Even in hands like 10s, well, 9s not so often, but mostly 10s. So it's important to check some good hands so that you can also check raise. Otherwise, your opponent is just going to stab you to death, and he's not really going to be very worried. Other tendencies, you'll see that it bets good draws pretty often. A hand like queen jack, let's say, around half the time, a bit more. And then a weak draw gets bet a little bit less often. Like, for instance, jack 7. Because jack 7 is just a much weaker draw, so less equity means less money in the pot. That's fairly intuitive, right? You'll see that, for instance, king, queen of clubs gets checked quite often because you want to have some nut flushes in your checking range once the flush does hit, and you have a bit of showdown value as well as good pair outs. Whereas a hand like king 4 suited with the flush draw gets bet far more frequently because full equity is so more important when you only have the 4 kicker, because you'll be losing to all of these king highs, whereas with king queen obviously you have the nut no pair. You'll see that Pilot Solver checks weak flush draws sometimes because you don't want to lose flush over flush and potentially lose your whole stack. Second pairs very often get checked. You'll see here, second pair with a weak kicker gets checked almost always, and then the better the kicker, the more it bets. Makes sense, right? You want to sometimes bet second pair because your hand is still mostly ahead. You also want to have some trips when the 10 hits. But at the same time, you also want to have tens in your checking range because it's the perfect type of medium strength hands that you don't want to fill the pot too much with. And then when you have absolutely nothing, you generally want to just give up. Let's say we have a hand like 6-4 spades. We have a very weak backdoor straight draw, no backdoor flush draw, no particularly good blockers. You just want to give them up. So you'll see mostly bet with your good hands, mostly check with your medium strength hands and your nothing, and then mix it up by checking some nuts sometimes, checking some draws sometimes. It's all about mixing it up well so that you're balanced in every single spot. Jack 10-9 flush draw is another good example of a board where range betting is simply too aggressive, but range checking is too passive. Out of position is going to have all the two pairs, all the sets, all the straights, all the high equity hands like ace queen. So it's doing quite well. At the same time, in position is also going to have two pair and straights and pair plus draws, etc. So both players are doing quite well. You'll see that out of position has a little bit more than 50% of the EV. So it is ahead, but not by that much. So if you're not ahead that much, it doesn't make sense to build the pot really big. Unlike on Ace Jack 4 Rainbow, where if you're ahead, it's very difficult for villain to have a lot of equity. If you have a hand like Ace King, either you're very far ahead of your opponent or you're very far behind. There's not too many hands with lots of equity in position's range on Ace Jack 4, whereas here in position we'll have a lot of good hands like, let's say, Queen 9 or King 10. So I ran this board with multiple sizes as well, and third pot was by far most dominant, so this is the final sim. You see that it checks most of the time, but checking always is just too passive. It's a very tricky board to play because a lot of turns and rivers are gonna cause trouble, but you cannot get away with checking every time when you have so many more sets and you have all the nuts. You'll see similar patterns. You'll see that weaker top pairs get checked most of the time. You'll see that most of the middle pairs get checked quite often. You'll see that even sets get checked quite often, just like in the other board. It's just a board we want to put in less money on in general, so we check all of those hands a little bit more often. You'll see that under pairs get bet sometimes as a mergy bluff, but the slightly higher pairs, not really. The high over pairs get checked sometimes because they are decent hands, but they have no blockers to the nuts, and they don't need that much protection, so you check them. A hand like queens is obviously better than aces because not only do you have the open ender, but if your opponent starts raising, you will be blocking his value hands. So you see, on a board like this, we're checking quite often, which means that we have to mix it up with all of our hands. A hand like Ace King of Hearts, for instance, still gets checked most of the time. But then, again, a hand like Ace 5 of Hearts, which doesn't have a great kicker, gets bet most of the time. So you see that even though all of these boards are completely different, the tendencies are always the same. So if you learn about these tendencies, you'll be able to predict what pile solver is going to do in a spot that you have not studied. So that is really the key to studying well. So just to recap, because I know it's a lot of information to take in. We can range bet on boards that are very good for us. For instance, the Broadway boards or the high-low-low boards where the high card is better for us and the low cards are kind of insignificant. We have to be very careful on bad boards for our range, and I'm suggesting a range check. For instance, the middling straightening cards, where in position we'll have lots of two pairs and sets and straights, etc. We can play a simplified strategy or play a mixed strategy on certain boards. The boards that are good for us, but quite tricky. Like, for instance, Jack 10-9, a board which is great, but it's also good for in position. In general, I would try and keep it as simple as possible because it's so difficult to play out of position. And that does not really sacrifice a lot of EV. Obviously, you don't want to play a poor strategy just for the sake of not making any mistakes. It's better to play a good strategy very well than a perfect strategy poorly. Now let's have a look at imposition. First up, flop floating. Obviously this is only possible once villain has a checking range, and flop floating strategies really depend on the board, obviously. The better a board is for out of position, the worse it is for imposition, and therefore we generally want to size up and bet a more polarized range. Whereas if the board is very good for us, we can bet much more depolarized. And that means you can bet far more often. Adjustments to your opponent are also very important. I'm suggesting that you check your range on 6-5-4, but a lot of opponents may not. So if you see them c-bet those boards at a decent frequency, it means when they check, they are likely very weak. So even if Piosover suggests, let's say, betting 45% on 6-5-4, if villain has bet his best hands, then his checking range is very weak in face-up, and we can respond by being overly aggressive. So let's look at these boards again, but then from imposition's perspective. On 6-5-4, we've checked our range. And you see that when we allow Piosover to stab half pot, it bets quite often. Almost 50% of the time. And I think this makes sense. The board is very good for imposition, which means it puts in quite a bit of aggression. If you look at the EV for imposition, even though the small blind raised and we only called, we have more EV imposition. I see that we even have almost more than 50% equity, which is very rare when you're the preflop caller. So this board is fairly good for us, which means we stab at a decent frequency. The tendencies will be similar. You'll see, for instance, that weak top pairs, again, get checked back quite frequently, whereas top pairs do not. The nuts obviously doesn't get checked back frequently, but occasionally. You'll see that high overcards like king, queen, king, jack, queen, jack get checked back a decent amount because they'll be blocking our opponent's check folding range, and we're also dominated by some of his stronger check calls. They also have decent showdown value, they just want to realize equity. Whereas you'll see that the lower stuff here, the 8 highs, the 9 highs, the 10 highs, they often get bet. And obviously the better our draw, the more often we'll bet. So for instance, a hand like Queen 7 of diamonds gets bet very often because we have an open-ender and the flush draw. Whereas if we look at a hand like Queen Deuce of diamonds, we only have a gut shot to a weaker straight, so we bet our hand less often. So the better your draw, the more often you bet. But mixing it up once again is key. So we have to check back some flush draws, we have to check back some top pairs, medium pairs, we check back no equity again. So let's say we have a hand like Queen 9 offsuit with a spade, let's say, you'll see that it checks back quite often. If we have the heart, we bet slightly more often because we can use our 9 of hearts as leverage on later streets occasionally. So we bet this hand sometimes, but not that often. Now let's look at ace 10 9. Once we check, my prediction is that we're going to stab far less frequently because this board is simply far worse for us. You'll see that out of position has far more than 50% of the EV, as well as 57% equity. So it only stabs 28%. I allowed Pio to only bet 3/4 pot, because this is the suggested sizing when I use multiple options. So you'll see that the board is worse for us, which means we stab less frequently. And when we do stab, we're repping a polarized range, which means that we want to bet large. So you'll see obviously it bets its strongest hands, 2 pair, very often, but then the weaker top pairs, it doesn't bet very often. I can tell you the same story again about checking some straight draws, flush draws, which ones to do it with, but it's the same story every time. So it's important that you find these patterns so you can use them for future hands. So the board is very bad for you. You still want to bet sometimes. When you do, you want to bet big. And then the better the board is, the smaller you want to bet, and the more often you want to bet. And the same goes for, let's say, a button big blind spot. The better the board is, the more often you want to bet. If the board is not very good for you, you check back more often, which means you also have to check back some more flush draws, straight draws, no equity hands, nuts, etc. You can learn more about that in the imposition play video. Now on to the turn. First off, out of position. Once we've c-bet the flop at a high frequency, so with our full range, we have to check on a lot of turns. There's a lot of turns on which we don't improve our equity, so we'll have almost nothing. And generally when you have nothing, you don't want to bet. We'll also have hands that had a bit of value that don't have any more value. So if you bet at a high frequency on the flop, you have to check a lot on the turn. Now, if you bet a polarized range on the flop, then since you've checked most of your weaker hands, it makes sense that on a clean card you bet more often. Which brings me to my third point. You have to read different board structures. If you bet ace 10-9 with a polarized range and the turn is a deuce, the deuce doesn't change anything. So you want to keep betting with most of your hands. Whereas on ace jack 4, there's far more hands like 8-6 suited that did not improve their equity that now just want to check. So the cleaner the card, the more aggressive you want to be. I'll show you guys an example. So our first example is king 4 deuce. We've bet our full range. You'll see that imposition raises this board pretty aggressively. It's a board that doesn't really hit either person, so fold equity is very important because both players are often just going to have a 3 straight 3 flush that will be put in a tough spot, or a no equity hand even. So we've bet our full range on the flop. We are raising at a high frequency, and now the turn is an ace. So you see that on a good card for our range, we're still checking at a high frequency, 72%, but then when we bet very large. If the card is good but slightly worse, you'll see that it still overbets aggressively, but the smaller bet starts being introduced. So you see that on great cards, pile solver is very aggressive, and then the worse the card is, the less aggressive we are. So if we pick a very blank card, like a 5, you'll see that all of a sudden it prefers to block bet. Imposition is going to have some straights, it still has a lot of top pairs, and out of position, bricked with a ton of hands, with queen jack, jack 9, 10-9, etc. Tons of hands between 5 and king that just have absolutely nothing. If we pick a similar card, like let's say a 7, you'll see that it's passive again, with only small bets. So if the card is good for us, and the board is quite dynamic, we go for the large bet, and when the card is not necessarily bad for us, but doesn't really change the board, or if it's bad for us, then we go for the small bet. I think that makes a lot of sense intuitively. Let's look at some of its tendencies. You'll see they're similar to the flop tendencies. Our best kickers get bet very often, and the weakest kickers don't. You'll see that our nuts get bet very often, let's say a hand like pocket 4s, but we sometimes mix it up with, let's say, pocket kings, pocket aces, because we block some of our opponent's continuing range. We bet most of our good hands, our good draws, let's say jack 10, but if we have a weaker draw, we bet a little bit less often. We also can turn some hands into a bluff, like let's say 4-3 suited, because they block the straight, they block 2 pair, and we can get our opponent off a king or an ace with a triple barrel bluff. And this hand is a great candidate. If our opponent has worse than a 4 by the river, he's often going to turn his hand into a bluff anyway, and it's going to be very difficult to call down with just a 4, when our opponent can easily have a king or an ace. On the dry turn, the 7 of diamonds, you'll see that it bets at a medium frequency for the small sizing, and you see that medium strength hands get bet a lot for value as well as protection. Again, we check our weaker top pairs but bet more often with our stronger top pairs. I'm almost sounding at a broken record at this point because all of these tendencies are being repeated. So once you've learned them, you will know about future spots. Let's make the board a bit more tricky. King 4 deuce, admittedly, is not the hardest board to play. Second example, ace 10 9. So we've bet our polarized range on the flop. Obviously, in position should not be raising too much because we're saying we have a very good hand, and in position has good hands but few amazing hands. So in position only raises around 3%. You could even get away with never raising the flop. That would only sacrifice a little bit of EV. So we've called, and then on a 3, obviously you should be betting with a polarized range at a decent frequency. Because on the flop we're saying we have a good hand, so what does the 3 change other than our opponent having exactly ace 3? So it bets at a high frequency for a huge sizing. So you see again, mostly good top pairs, mostly sets, but not all of them, mostly good draws, checking mostly when we have absolutely nothing. So let's say a hand like that dreaded 6-4 spades again, you see 99% check because we just have zero equity. But then if the card is worse for us, obviously we have to slow down. So let's pick the 7 of clubs. You see that on the 7 of clubs, wow, it checks full range. That is very passive. In position is going to have lots of flushes, especially when you barely raise the flop. It's going to have Jack 8 offsuit. It's going to have a 7 offsuit. It's going to have Queen 10 or Queen 9 with a club. It's going to have all kinds of really good hands. So out of position should be very careful here. This is a pretty extreme example, of course. If we pick a slightly lower club, you'll see that pile solver is still very passive by only betting 40% and by only block betting, but at least it's getting a bit more aggressive now. So you see that when the card is clean, we bet often with a polarized range. And then if the card is quite scary, like a 4, we slow down. And if the card is super scary, we have to slow down even more and potentially check our full range. Let's pick a slightly different card. So on a king of clubs, same thing. Flush got there, straight got there, 2 pairs got there, but at least it's a king. And out of position, we'll have a big ace king and pocket kings advantage, as well as a queen jack advantage, because in position would at least 3-bet queen jack suited pre-flop. It would maybe raise the flop if you do have a flop raising range. So it's not a bad card, but it's also not the greatest card. In position is still doing quite well here. So you'll see that in position has more EV still than out of position. That's why we size down. So to recap all of this, the better the card, the more aggressive you want to be with a larger sizing. That makes a lot of sense intuitively. So what about 6-5-4? We checked our entire range on the flop. So if let's say we had a hand like 7-8 suited, we would have liked to build a pot. Villain bets 30 on the flop. Obviously, we're going to raise hands like 8-7 most of the time, and you'll see the same things happening again. It's not folding a whole lot versus half pot. If villain decides to bet larger, obviously you fold more. If it bets smaller, you fold less. When it goes check, check, let's pick an ace, a very good card. We're obviously betting quite often. We can do a couple of things. We can use large bets as well as small bets here. So as long as on the ace, you bet often because you checked all of your nutted hands on the flop. And some hands like, let's say, ace-king were not very good on the flop, but they're now good on the turn. So obviously on the ace, we're going to be aggressive. Now if we pick a decent card for our range, you'll see all of a sudden it starts becoming more passive. We start checking a bit more. The jack is kind of a neutral card. And then the lower the card, the worse it is for us. If the turn is a 7, obviously our bet, it's actually surprising that our frequency is still quite high, but our bet size decreases because in position can still easily have a flush or a straight or a 2 pair or maybe a set. So you have to be very careful. if the turn is something like a 4, we can be moderately aggressive. So it's quite difficult to figure out a strategy here, because as you can see, it uses all bet sizes at a similar frequency. So I would say the better the card is, the more often you want to bet, and also the more polarized. And the worse the card, the smaller you bet, which is in line with what we've learned on earlier streets. How do we approach the double barrel then? So we bet half pot, we did not get raised, and then on the 10, you'll see it bets 3/4 pot. So on the flop, we're repping a lot of medium strength hands. On the turn 10, the board is still quite dry, at least it's not super wet, so our range is moderately polarized, but not extremely polarized. Now on the ace, it makes a lot more sense to bet big, right? Because if let's say you have a hand like king 6, you don't want to bet the turn anymore, because which worse hand are you getting called by? Almost none, and you definitely don't want to get check raised. So now we're betting far less often, but when we do, we are repping a very nutted hand. On the 4, you also see that it bets quite aggressively, mostly with the overbet, because the 4 hits in position sometimes, and we want to bet big with all of our nutted hands. And if we have a 6, it's still looking pretty good. Unlike on the ace, where out of position will now have lots of top pairs that you are not ahead of anymore. Not only can your opponent have some flushes, some straights, some 2 pairs, he can also just have a lot of pairs plus draw, such as, for instance, aces plus diamonds. So you have to be more careful. It's also a bit more difficult to set up a bluffing range when the board is kind of locked down, because if here you have a straight or a set, it's almost impossible to be behind. So you see, if the card is clean, we tend to overbet. If the card is bad for us, we still overbet, but we are a bit more careful. And then when the card is kind of scary for both people, we size down. So just to recap that, we checked at a high frequency after betting our full range on the flop. The worse the card, the more often we check. On the clean cards, we can bet a bit more and we bet larger. So you have to get lots of value, because if on, let's say, ace jack 4, we have pocket jacks, ideally we don't bet third pot. Ideally we overbet the flop, because we are just looking to get the money in against an ace. So we've sacrificed a little bit by betting small with jacks. So we have to get the value back on the turn and the river. And it's important to read into different board structures, see how both ranges interact with the board. How many nutted hands do both players have? How many medium strength hands with decent equity? How many no equity hands? So every board is different, so make sure to judge them all individually. So on to in position play on the turn. On some boards you have to stab polarized, and on some boards you have to stab depolarized. Now back to the king 4 deuce, and let's talk about floating for a bit. So we've bet our full range, and the turn is a 7, and we check, like we're going to do for a lot of our range. You'll see that I've allowed in position to bet either 3/4 pot or a third pot. And you see that when the card is kind of dry, you just bet small. You're looking to clear out equity if villain has a hand like 10-9, let's say. Whereas if the board is very wet and villain checks a lot of medium strength hands, we're repping a polarized range. An example is on ace 10-9. We bet large, call, the turn is a 4, on which in position will overbet or check. Once he does decide to check, you see that in position bets only large basically. It even overbets sometimes. So it checks back quite often. And you'll see that if you make the board even more draw heavy, it even decides to overbet more often than it bets large. So when the board is dry, you stab small at a higher frequency, and when the board is very wet and your opponent checks kind of strong, then you're repping a polarized range. So to recap, when the board is wet and out of position checks his medium strength hands, we want to stab large with a polarized range. Whereas if he just has a lot of hands that didn't improve on a blank turn, we can stab small at a higher frequency. And adjustments to villain are even more important this time, because some villains may just never check good hands, or almost never, in which case we can go crazy as imposition. If he just always checks with weak draws that are going to give up, or maybe a second pair, we can put a lot of pressure on our opponent and run him over. And the double barrel should generally be pretty large for imposition, because you don't want to stab thinly anymore with second pair. Now it's time to get big value. Now onto the river, first out of position. You have to attack capped ranges pretty hard. Remember, when you c-bet and then bet the turn and your opponent hasn't raised, he's repping a range of mostly medium strength hands, whereas you still have far more strong hands. So you have to get max value from that medium strength range of your opponents. And then you have to pot control on bad cards, which is what we've already seen on the turn. Except now the pot is much larger, so it's more likely that villain has a pretty good hand. So let's have a look at that. On ace-9 deuce, we bet polarized. On the turn, we'll overbet. And you'll see that it doesn't really raise much, of course, because out of position is repping a very strong range. We call, and let's pick the safest possible card, the deuce. Unless in position has specifically ace deuce, this card doesn't really hurt out of position. Or maybe king deuce of clubs. So you see it bets all in over a pot extremely often, 44% of the time. Makes sense, right? Because if you have, let's say, ace jack, ace queen plus, how does your opponent have you beat? He would have often 3-bet pre-flop with the better aces, with the sets. The deuce doesn't hit anybody, so you want to get max value and look to get called by, let's say, a hand like ace 5, or some kind of blocker hand like king 10. So you see here, it bets all in even over a pot with even, decent top pairs. And obviously it's going to go all in with hands like pocket 10s, because with pocket 10s you unblock the ace, which may call you. Now, a hand like aces is not even in this range because we checked it on the turn, because it was blocking his turn calling range. So you see, top set often gets slow played. A hand like pocket deuces almost never gets slow play because, again, we unblock the calling range. And you'll see that it's bluffing mostly with, let's say, low flush draws and the low stuff. But if, let's say, you have a hand like queen jack of clubs, sure, your hand was amazing on the turn, but on the river you're blocking your opponent's folds, because villain is often going to call with queen 8 of clubs, call the turn again, and then when he misses, he's going to fold. So you remove some of your opponent's auto folds. So on the deuce, we will be extremely aggressive. On a card like the king, we can also be pretty aggressive. We now hit our straight. We still have some hands like ace-king that are very strong, as well as all the other good stuff. But villain now improves a little bit more as well. So you see that we're very aggressive and we're bluffing the same types of hands, but all slightly less often. When we pick a very scary card like the 7 of diamonds, obviously out of position is going to be a bit more passive, because in position can easily have a flush, some 2 pairs, some straights. So you'll see that it starts introducing the small bet. So once again, the better the card, the more aggressive we are. Very simple. And it's still bluffing the same types of hands in every single spot. If we pick something like a 3 of diamonds, we can be a little bit more aggressive again. We can bet a bit more often because the 3 doesn't complete the straight, and it doesn't complete as many 2 pairs. On king 4 deuce, it's the same story. If we pick the ace of clubs, we saw it overbets very aggressively, or somewhat aggressively at least. So we overbet, call. So if we pick something like a 7, a card that doesn't really change much, you see that we bet pretty aggressively. It doesn't actually overbet that much. That's somewhat surprising, but you see that the big bet gets used pretty frequently. On similar cards, like an 8, all the same story. And on good cards like a queen, we can be even more aggressive, because now we have hands like Jack 10 that in position doesn't have. We have Ace Queen, which now is not behind hands like Ace 4 anymore. So you see we bet very, very aggressively. So once again, the better the card, the more often we bet. If we have the nuts and we unblock our opponent's calling range like deuces, we want to shove. If we have a hand like, let's say, aces, we might have checked on an earlier street. Hand like ace king, you may not want to shove always, because when you block 2 pair, you kind of block your opponent's calling range. It's more likely that he has a hand like Jack 9 of clubs that will now auto-fold the river. If we pick a bad card, although to be fair, there's not that many really bad cards, right? A 5 of clubs, let's say, that's a pretty scary card. You'll see it now bets really small. The 3 is not a big part of villain's range, although he can have king 3 suited. He can have some stuff like ace 3, 4 3 maybe. So it's part of his range, but it's not hugely relevant. If we pick an offsuit 5, on an offsuit 5, Pio also prefers a small bet, but it's still quite aggressive, because the 3 again is not a big part of villain's range. But on a deuce, it bets very, very aggressively again. You'll see here that on a deuce, it bets very aggressively again, because the deuce doesn't really hit in position unless he has deuce X of clubs, which is a very, very small part of imposition's range. So you'll see that shove is the most dominant sizing. Now on to imposition. First, the polarized third barrel. We bet somewhat polarized on some flops, a bit less polarized on others. On the turn, we got lots of value with a polarized range. And on the river, you have to attack your opponent's capped range, because he's only check called twice, so he's not repping a bad hand, but he's also not repping many nutted hands. So now it's time for you to get max value. So back to 6-5-4 flush draw. We bet half pot. Turn is a king. We overbet only, because the king is a card that hits out of position somewhat hard, so we want to check back quite often, and when we do bet, we want to rep a very good hand. So we overbet, call, and we'll pick a safe-ish card, like a 10. You'll see that it mostly bets all in, because our good hands are still extremely strong. Straights, sets, 2 pairs, etc. Now if the card is a bit more dynamic, like a 7, you see it sizes down, because you'll see that even a set is not worth that much anymore, and it even checks in behind, so we're betting mostly with a straight. So you saw on the clean card, we attack his capped range, and when the card is not necessarily bad for imposition, but definitely not fantastic, we size down. I think that makes sense. I think that makes a lot of sense intuitively. Let's not forget that we can also use other lines, such as a bet check bet line. So if we check on the bad card, the king, it really depends on the card how aggressive out of position will be. On, let's say, an ace, it's going to be very aggressive. You'll see that it bets very often, mostly for a medium sizing. We're saying that we only check called and checked, so we're not repping the nuts, but at the same time we're repping a pretty strong range, so we're still betting quite often. 3/4 pot as well as small. But then on a slightly better card for imposition, it will bet more often. So on the 10 of diamonds, for instance, you'll see that we bet 3/4 pot most of the time. So once we check, we're saying, okay, we probably have some showdown value, but our hand is not great. So if the river doesn't improve us much, we're not really repping the nuts. So an overbet doesn't really make sense unless the card really improves our range. So to recap, we polarize ourselves on the river and get max value, and we attack hard when the card is great for us, once we've shown a lot of strength, and once we've shown weakness by checking back either the flop or the turn. On the river, we mostly rep medium strength hands. To finalize, some tips. What should I do facing a small blind limp? I said we should not be limping the small blind, but obviously some opponents do. Against a small blind limp, I recommend raising around the top 40% of your hands. We can check back some slightly stronger hands, like let's say a hand like King 6 suited sometimes, or a hand like King 9 offsuit. Hands that are quite solid in terms of equity, but hands that don't really want to get limp 3-bet. We can also raise some trashier hands, like let's say the lower offsuit kings or the lower offsuit queens, or some trashy suited hands. If you're playing an anti-game, villain has much more incentive to limp because he's getting a better price. There's more money in the pot. He's got his own money invested. So he's going to play a wider range, which means you have to respond by also raising a wider range. Lastly, we will face different types of open raising sizes and ranges. The wider your opponent opens, the more equity you have, so the more you want to 3-bet. It also means that you want to charge more hands in villain's range to see the flop. So if he's raising a very wide range, you have to call wider, but also 3-bet wider. If he's opening a tighter range, obviously we can start folding more. If he opens with a smaller sizing, then he generally opens a wider range, so we can again 3-bet more. If he opens maybe 3.5x, he should do that with a tighter range, which means we should still 3-bet a decent amount, but mostly fold more. So the strategy we worked with today was based on a 3x raise from a roughly 43% opening range. Now, if he deviates, it's extremely important you deviate as well. So these strategies are only guidelines. You have to be able to adjust to your opponent at all times, because obviously they do not play like solvers. We likely never will. So even if you think a play is correct in pile solver, it may not be correct in game. It will probably be a very good play, but there may be a better play out there. So don't be afraid to adjust. Poker is a game of adjustments after all. I hope you guys found this video useful and learned something, and hopefully I'll see you in the next video. This was MMA Sherdog for the Bluff the Spot High Stakes course. Good luck at the tables.